Welcome to the Emergent Human, where we explore optimizing health and body spirituality in post-conventional living. I'm Michael Ostrolenk, a therapist, coach, educator, and I'm your host. Quick shout out to my friend Erwan LaCour and his new online program called MoveNat Mobility, which is a revolutionary 4-week program built with simple, practical movements that can be applied to everyday life. You can find more at www.movenat.com. Today's show is brought to you by Cosper Scafidi, an amazing body worker in the Northern Virginia area who has integrated different somatic practices into his work, including Rolfing. To learn more about Cosper's work, you can visit on his website, www.cosperscafidi.com. Our guest today is Luba Vangelova, who has written about the future of learning for media outlets such as The Atlantic and NPR, PBS, the Mindship websites, and has co-founded and managed several pioneering mixed-age co-learning groups in the Washington, D.C. area. In 2020, she launched The Hub, www.thehub.community, as an online co-learning community for ages 9 to 12. It is eventually envisioned to grow into an all-age co-learning, co-working community with both online and physical presence that anyone can freely replicate in their chosen locale. Hello, Luba.
Hello, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, it's great to finally have you on. You and I have been talking for years and years, which is very cool. So one of the critiques that people such as yourself have who've explored education, the conventional education system, is that the authoritarian industrial model really does not serve the full education of children. And in your explorations, you have discovered other more child-centric models, which actually serve the full potential of human beings. Can you speak about those explorations and what you've discovered along the way?
Sure. So I've done a lot of research. I've talked to education professionals. I've visited many schools and other types of learning centers in different parts of the country. I've talked to many parents and also children. And basically, I think it comes down to customization, because people are all different, and yet the conventional, and I don't usually refer to it as traditional because it's not really traditional if you look at the big enough, picture. But the conventional education model is not really geared to cater to individuals. It's geared to cater to the imaginary average person that doesn't really exist. And so all of the different strengths and, interests and preferences that different people, different individuals will have within a group, they're sort of just kind of overlooked in the conventional education model, and it forces people to basically just try and be standardized units, which humans are not. And for some people, that's, good enough because they're close enough to what is being offered, or they're willing to go along with what's being offered, and they're not, bothered enough by it for one reason or another. But for other people, it can just really start to be an issue because it's so different from either where they're at in the moment in terms of abilities, either on the slower side or faster side, or their interests. They may be interested in something very passionately at the moment, but what's being taught in the moment as part of their curriculum is something so completely different that, it's, the frustration builds up because they can't learn about what they are interested in. And so it's sort of a mismatch between individuals and customization versus standardization.
Can you give some examples of where the match is correct, like some examples of schools or collectives that are actually organizing around the needs, desires, aspirations, and abilities of children?
Sure. So on the micro scale, an example would be a family that is pursuing independent learning, aka homeschooling. I mean, the term homeschooling has sort of become appropriated to be applied to school led distance learning, but in the sense of independent learning. At the family level, that would be an example where parents can very much tailor things to an individual child. They can be very responsive to what that child is driven to learn at any given point in time, how quickly or how slowly they're driven to learn it. They can pivot as the situation changes. And then as you introduce more and more children into the equation, I mean, it does become significantly more complex with each new child, that's introduced. But there are schools such as the Sudbury schools or the Agile Learning Centers that do a version of this for larger groups of children, where the learning is based on a consensual model, where the child consents and even requests to learn about something. And so it's sort of like having a menu of options and self-selection, where the children self-select into, what to spend their time on and how and where, where within the school campus. Like, they don't have to be, sitting in one space, the whole day and have, recess at a certain time and so on. It's much more fluid and organic and self-selected and consent-based, based on the children being active participants in their education and self-directing a lot of it. Not necessarily all of it. I mean, there are, it's a whole spectrum of customization. There are places where there's a lot of where there's a great deal of freedom. Then there are places where there are certain requirements. You have to be here for, learning these things at these times, but that only takes up, some small fraction of the day, and the rest of the day is open to do basically electives, where everything becomes, or everything else, in depending on the program, becomes an elective. And so there's really no one way to do this. It's quite the spectrum of customization.
Let me ask you this, and how you might respond, because I'm sure you've gotten pushback, because I've heard it the same, where people say, okay, that's great, child might be interested in X, Y, or Z, but they need to learn how to read, they need to learn how to write, they need to learn how to do whatever the thing of the day is for children to succeed in the business space once they graduate school. How might you argue against that position or that concern that people might have?
Well, most children are driven, if left to their own devices, are motivated to become functioning, contributing participants in society. I mean, few people are driven to be, just like non-participants. I mean, if something is truly necessary and is required in order to function in society, children will naturally be motivated to acquire that knowledge and those skills. Otherwise, they'll see themselves fall further behind compared to their peers. They won't be able to do a lot of things in society. So it's a matter of starting out with the overall goals and working backwards. And the goals may be different for different children. I mean, then you work backwards from the goals and what kind of knowledge and skills are needed in order to attain the next step of the goal, and in order to eventually become a fully functional content member of society. So most people wouldn't really have to be forced to read if left to their own devices, and if reading is truly necessary, which it pretty much is in our society, in order to be a part of society. I mean, it's like children don't have to be forced to learn to walk. They don't have to be forced to do a lot of things before age 5, or before they get sent to school. They just were driven to learn, and that same drive can continue in other areas.
Would a child, all things being equal, gain the same skills as a child in conventional school, maybe later, but better? And let me give you an example. So, because I keep hearing the push for kids to read younger and younger and younger. Or to learn math younger, the kind of the basic, the R's. And I'm wondering, like, okay, developmentally, is that even appropriate? And if a child's motivated by their own innate curiosity and interest, and if they eventually get to learning how to read, comprehend what they're reading, doing math, doing science, I'm guessing would probably do it at a time that's more appropriate to them and learn it in their own way. So they might actually learn it better than someone doing rote learning at a younger age. Would that be accurate? Possible?
I don't know about better necessarily, but certainly Dr. Peter Gray, a developmental psychologist affiliated with Boston College, has done a lot of research in this area. And he found that children who were given the freedom to learn to read at their own pace learned to read anytime between age 4 and age 14 among the people that he studied, that he surveyed. And so that is a pretty wide range. But what he also found is that the children who learned later were not negatively affected. I think this is probably contingent on whether or not they were shamed about it in any way, because shame, has a very kind of powerful negative force to it. But basically, he said, after that, you really couldn't tell the difference between, you wouldn't be able to know who had learned to read at a younger age and who had learned to read at a later age. One real I think outlier example that I heard of was someone who had gone to the Summerhill self-directed school in the United Kingdom. It was a school that was started, I think it was in the 1920s, and it's still very much around. And one graduate from decades ago was interviewed about his experience, and he basically took the freedom to a considerable extent, and he just didn't bother to learn to read, even when he had graduated. When he left at age 19, he still couldn't read, but then he traveled the world and eventually not being able to read posed enough of a headache for him. I think it was while he was in Japan and having to fill out some forms, and because people find ways to work around not
Mhm.
being able to read,
Right, right.
up until the point at which it's so frustrating that the act of learning to read starts to feel less frustrating than what they're dealing with. And so that balance was finally tipped for him, and he spent a few months, he learned to read, and he then ended up, I believe he eventually got a master's degree. He became an industrial consultant for businesses around the world. I mean, this is someone who learned to read, you know,
Uh,
after his teen years. So
yes.
it's the importance of the age at which reading happens is just, I think, far more exaggerated than what experiences of people would suggest is warranted. And a lot of that, I think, is because of the standardized curriculum that is followed in conventional education settings, because it assumes, again, it's targeted for the mythical average person. And so it assumes that all children will learn to read by a certain age. And so they base the curriculum on that assumption. And so, yes, if a child who is put into a setting that follows that curriculum, they will be struggling and kind of falling further and further behind if they do not learn to read by the age at which it's assumed they will know how to read. But that's a design feature of the system. That's not something
Mhm.
that's just based on the natural, you know, learning and the bell curve of, the learning among humans.
Let me ask you two other questions, things that I've heard people argue against kind of this child-centered, semi unschooling approach to learning. Um, one would be from a class question, and it might be something like, well, if you're middle class or upper class, then you have all the resources and the time and the tutors and the community and all the resources necessary to support any child doing unschooling, or you could afford to send your child to this kind of particular child-centered school. If you're lower on the economic ladder, you don't have the resources, you don't have the time to support a child at home to learn, and or the resources to send a child to a private school.
Mhm.
Um, but I do believe there actually are quite a few examples of unschooling being done in lower middle class
Mhm.
and poor families, and there are ways to get kids in some of these schools who don't have a lot of money. Can you speak
Mhm.
a little bit to that as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way our society is structured economically, there's no getting around the fact that certain things are going to be more accessible to people with more money, because that's just how our economic system is structured. But in terms of individuals, absolutely, there are individuals who fall into the lower tiers in terms of financial assets, who have done self-directed education, either through independent learning, or through enrollment in some type of learning center or schools. Some of these learning centers and schools are supported, they're nonprofits in some cases, and they're supported by donations. And so, and in some cases, even if they're not nonprofits, they will not turn people away for a lack of financial resources. They um, run the tuition figures in such a way that some of the people who are lucky enough to be able to pay full tuition, um, their part of their tuition can be used to subsidize people who are in less fortunate positions.
Mhm.
And so there are definitely examples of families and organizations that are catering to a variety of, a very broad range of socioeconomic strata.
Another pushback that I do hear too is, yeah, but what about socialization? Which I know you'd laugh because I'm sure you heard that a million times as well.
Well, so then the question is, how does one define socialization? Does one define it by, segregating children with peers of exactly the same age all day, every day, with one or however many adult teachers? Or do you define socialization as having the ability and opportunities to mix socially with people of different ages, whether they're children or adults, and have meaningful conversations with a range of different adults in the community, whether it's through just participating in everyday life activities with parents, or whether it's through enrollment in programs that are run by, this adult or that adult. There are clubs and, just all sorts of hobby groups, sports groups. There's so many opportunities
Mhm.
for socialization that it's really kind of funny that that question still gets asked.
Yeah,
But it
no,
does,
yeah,
yes. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, right.
yeah. Sure. Let me ask you another question. So, and this is kind of more of a broad socio-cultural kind of
Mhm,
30,000 foot view. And this is what I like to state when I talk about unschooling or democratic free schools or some of these kind of alternative models versus the conventional model. And I would like your opinion, whether this is accurate and how you might say it or say it differently. That there seems to be a mixed match because America is supposed to be self-governing. American citizens are supposed to be self-governing individuals. However, our education system is very authoritarian and makes us objects of someone else authority. Like the teacher up in front of the room, we move by the bell, we
mhm,
break things up into 50-minute subjects. If
mhm,
that's how we do it, we move from one to the other. It's very industrial, very robotic.
mhm,
It seems to me that that does not create self-governing, whole, healthy, fully functioning human beings. That model, it seems like it more creates cogs in an industrial government machine
mhm,
versus like the model that you're talking about, which is really about self-governance. Like
mhm,
children learn to govern themselves, follow
mhm,
their own interests, work collaboratively with others,
mhm,
which seems to be it's a model more reflective
mhm,
of the intent of our country, which is self-governing. Would
mhm.
you agree to something like that, or might you say it differently, or how might you see it?
Yeah. So I think it's interesting the way you phrased it, because you said Americans are supposed to be, I think you said supposed to be,
Yeah.
self-governing. So I think emphasis on supposed to be,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of arguments to be made about the fact that no, we are actually not self-governing, and um, that it's a what's the term? It's escaping me at the moment, but an oligarchy, basically, system. Um, and so I think the education and governance and economic systems are all kind of parts of a there's a feedback loop going on there. And so I absolutely think that the education model with um, the kind of requirement to follow authorities that other people have chosen to put in positions of authority um, is very much reflective of the governance system and the economic system. And so I think it is all very congruent. Now, is it congruent with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? No, I would say it is not.
Mhm.
And conventional schooling really only came to be on a mass scale in the middle of the 1800s. So it dates after the founding of the United States by quite a bit. um, and so, yeah, I mean, if the idea is reinforced enough that you need to just do as you're told, you should have no say in, what you're learning or how and so on. I mean, it does certainly create a certain, um, or it tends to create, depending on how much pushback there is from the individual, um, a, a willingness to go along with a lot of things, rather than look to oneself as the, being empowered to affect things. It, I think, does create, um, or is likely to create, a feeling of looking outward from oneself for direction, for reinforcement, for validation. So it's very kind of other regarding in that sense,
Mhm.
as opposed to, fostering self-sovereignty and taking accountability and responsibility for oneself and for one's
Yeah.
community, because it's never just about oneself, by the way. I mean, like, even though the term that is often used is self-directed education, it's not all about oneself. I mean, a person only exists within the context of a community. So um, the needs of others also have to be taken into account, but it's about taking responsibility for oneself rather than expecting others to take responsibility for you if you are able to take responsibility for yourself.
It would seem to me that the self-directed approach creates kind of more likely creates the opportunity for children to be autonomous but interconnected
Interconnected, yes.
human beings.
Interdependent, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
kind of the what I tend to call, so in the hub micro academy that we launched last fall, the facilitators and I often talk about striking a balance between the me and the we, and
Nice.
we think of it as kind of modeling a culture that, I mean, it's all fractals, like the culture within the micro academy is just a microcosm of the kind of culture that can exist within a larger community, where there's a healthy balance between um, meeting the interests and needs of individuals, but yet not 100% because there are other people around, and
Right, right, right.
you have to take everyone's needs and abilities and interests into account. But so there's a lot of negotiation and kind of finding the balance, where people feel like they have enough of a say and enough of a, ability to contribute and enough autonomy, but at the same time feel part of something bigger too.
Well, that's why I think, for instance, the democratic free schools as a model is very interesting
Hmm.
because, from what I understand of it, the children, depending on their age and stage, do participate in generating the rules that they have to follow, in
Hmm.
implementing the rules if they're broken.
Hmm. Yeah.
So there is a we and an I,
Hmm.
as you clearly stated, and I would imagine it makes for so much better collaboration and thoughtfulness in terms of human relationships than having this kind of authoritarian model where people just tell you how to be
Hmm.
instead of you trying to figure it out with other people how to be with other
Yeah.
people.
And I mean, I think it's best done with guidance, of course, from older,
Hmm?
wiser. Well, sometimes actually it's not the older people that are the wiser, but let's just say, the with guidance, but yeah, it creates buy-in. If someone understands the rules, if they had a hand in helping decide the rule, or at least had the opportunity to get involved. Not everyone wants to, get involved in all the discussions about every little, thing, but some,
Mm-hmm.
people do. And at least, if people really object, they have the opportunity to voice objections. And then people are much more invested in them, and they kind of tend to police themselves, kind of, through peer pressure, but in a positive way. I mean, peer pressure has a negative connotation because of the way it often manifests in these kind of artificial environments that are created where age groups are siloed and there's a hierarchy. And so it creates all sorts of behaviors that one doesn't find in kind of a more natural mix of people, where people can flow in and out and mix with different people, and where there isn't like a strict hierarchy, et cetera. But anyway, so peer pressure can also manifest in a very positive way um, to maintain a healthy culture and make sure that any behavior that is harmful to individuals or to the group as a whole, which often are, two sides of the same coin, is kept in check. Because if people are acting harmfully, they'll be, either shunned or, if there are rules that are being broken, they can be, depending on the processes at any given organization, there might be a judicial committee meeting called to discuss something and so on. But it tends to be much more of a restorative justice type of situation rather than a punitive situation. So, how do we, if someone was harmed, how do we try to help that person be made whole again, rather than someone was harmed, let's punish the other person. Now you've got two people harmed,
Right, right. You had mentioned the hub, which I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation when I introduced you. Talk to us about the hub. What is it?
Yeah, so it's envisioned to eventually be an all ages co-learning, co-working space. It was originally intended to be purely a physical space, and then COVID happened. And so I pivoted and started it out as an online hub. And the idea was to just start out with a narrow age range, get that really kind of solid, and then eventually expand. So right now it'll be for 9 to 13-year-olds. In the fall, right now it's 9 to 12, but it'll be 9 to 13 as of next fall. And there is a micro academy that meets 2 days a week. And it's a highly self-directed, but very much facilitated also experience. So it's multidisciplinary and very creative, with a lot of freedom to go in different directions depending on the interests of the group and so on, but operating within a certain framework and structure also that's guided by the facilitators. So it's sort of trying to strike a balance, again, not just between the me and the we, but between structure and freedom, because a lot of creativity really tends to blossom when there are certain kind of framework parameters, when it's not just pure freedom. So there is kind of some structure to it, but the structure can always be discussed and is, changeable if there's a compelling reason to change any of it. So it puts a lot of power into the hands of all the participants, and expects them to, be active participants, not just passively doing things. So everyone is a co-creator of the experience, and they've been doing all sorts of things from um, uh, writing stories together, um, and learning about mythology, playing geography games together. They created an entire world last term. That was their big multi-month project. And each child, we tried to, again, kind of looping back to what I said at the beginning about everyone being an individual. The idea is to look at what the strengths are and interests are of each person, and come up with different roles within a project that different children can play, so that they're building on their strengths, but also, at the same time learning to kind of manage any weaknesses that might be hindering them. And then they kind of work together to create something that they've all agreed to create. They hold each other accountable. So a lot of it is also about building the culture of community and kind of coexistence, co-creation. And so that's the Micro Academy. And then there are some a la carte options that'll be expanded in future years as the age range is also expanded. And eventually, hopefully by 2022, there will also be a physical space, and that can be built on to eventually have a menu of different cohort programs, and then more a la carte, just standalone elective things for different ages. Every, age from, just young, let's say 5-year-olds to 95-year-olds, because why
Lifelong
separate
learning.
people
Yeah.
by age, if there are opportunities for them to learn from each other, to again socialize together, to there might be instances when a 10-year-old and a 50-year-old might both be interested in learning the same thing. So why limit it to this class is only for this specific age, and just kind of removing all those artificial boundaries, still having age ranges where it makes sense, like for a cohort experience, as kind of a homeroom type of experience and so on, but also having enough flexibility to have mingling among ages, based more on interests and kind of more organic interactions. Mentorship opportunities could then arise, and so on.
That's fantastic. So let's come back to like now. So it's 9 to 12-year-olds. Are these only for homeschooling families, or if your kids in a private or public school, can they participate in some of these programs? Like, how does that work?
So for the Micro Academy, just because of the times when it's scheduled, I think it would be really not very practical if a child is also enrolled in a school to be able to participate. So really it's geared toward independent learning families for the Micro Academy. The a la carte options, though, we're trying to schedule those at different times on different days and so on. So, and we've only just kind of started offering those, so that part of the program will expand in future years, and that will be open to anyone, whether they're also affiliated with a school or not, it doesn't really matter. So, yeah.
That's great. And I know you want people to steal your model.
Yes, I do.
Lay out your vision for me, 5 to 10 years from now. And perhaps, as unfortunate and all the destruction from COVID has been, it seems to me that a lot of families and others are rethinking the whole education system, because they're recognizing the limits of it, and that most children get done within a couple hours what they seemingly took all day to do.
Right.
So 5 to 10 years from now, what could you imagine education looking like in our country as it maybe hopefully evolves in new
Yeah.
ways?
So, I mean, there are lots of ways it could go, but I could see one possibility being a network of, I mean, a loosely affiliated network of hubs, educational hubs that are sort of a mix of um, a school and a community center and a co-working hub where people can gather and take advantage of educational opportunities, but in a very customized, modular way, so that people who would like a very consistent cohort experience can sign up for, however many days of the week they would like, between 1 and 5 days a week for, something more in depth, where they're giving up some of their freedom to do things exactly as they wish, but what they gain is the group and cohort experience. And then having also just a la carte options like, a science lab or a makerspace workshop, language class or whatever. So basically, it can be like a menu where people choose, they can choose everything from the already created meal that's been put together for them, um, like something that's already curated where they don't have to really put many pieces together. But they also, if they're more, if they have more niche interests or more DIY tendencies, they can kind of put together an experience that suits them, much more specifically. So just kind of creating like a menu option. There was a place in, or is, I'm not sure if it's still there, in Brooklyn that called itself the Classeteria. And I think that's kind of a interesting way to, think of it, kind of like going to a cafeteria and being able to pick and choose, and or perhaps more so going to a farmer's market where there are prepared meals, but then there are also ingredients, and you can kind of put things together however you want, or you can buy the prepared meals, you can, commune with other people, and so on, but applied to education.
Nice. Well, I like your vision. And, my take on this is that the more and more families are recognizing this as a true alternative and actually moving this in this direction, while unfortunately at the same time, our broader education, conventional education system seems to get more and more concentrated and authoritarian. So it's like almost two streams, one heading
Yeah.
from our perspective in the wrong direction, and the other stream in our culture is heading in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've, obviously I want people to check out your hub. Can you share with us the URL?
Sure. It's www.thehub.community. And it's all in there. There's also a page I added recently there of resources, because, for parents who are new to these kinds of paradigms, and they're wondering, well, what else, can we do with the time? I put together a page of ideas for everything from like curriculum in a box, but where you can kind of pick and choose what elements you want to do and at what pace, to all sorts of just niche kind of programs uh, that exist out there, just to give people just a sense of just how many options
Mhm.
there are out there, and with as little or as much kind of um, already curated for the parents as they want. So if some parents want to get more involved, or if they want to be less involved, there are all sorts of opportunities to kind of piece things together to create something that is customized to an individual child.
Nice. Now, for people who need to kind of understand philosophically this new approach, you've done
Mhm.
quite a bit of writing.
Yeah.
Can you give us a URL or two of places we can go to like study this more?
Sure. So on my website, there are links to some of the most popular articles I've written, plus compilations. So that's www.lubavangelova.com. So LubaVangelova.com. And there are also websites such as www.alternatives2school.com that have links to many resources, articles, books, blogs. There is so much out there once you start digging. And that's actually one of the things, is that sometimes people actually get a little overwhelmed by just how much there is out there. But there are also people who, if needed, can kind of, who have been there, done that, and can lend a helping hand, either in Facebook groups or their consultants, and so on, if someone wants to go that route, to get some hand holding to help, cut through to what is most relevant to their particular family. So yeah, there's a lot out there.
That's fantastic. Well, good. I'll make sure to include all those links in the show notes. And Luba, it's great to talk to you.
Okay, you too.
Thank you for your time. Yeah, sure. And I wish you much luck and success with the hub.
Okay.
And I definitely hope lots of people here domestically in the States and across the world still have this idea.
Yes, let's hope so. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Luba.
All right, bye.